Indeed, not a single English or American sailor or traveler captured at sea by North African pirates between 1600 and 1775 described himself or herself as a white slave or even as white in over 36 published memoirs. Instead, they described themselves as Christian captives, as Christian slaves, and frequently as English slaves. To be a white slave was to be a Muslim, and if born in Europe, to be someone who had converted to Islam, a so-called renegade. To be a white slave was to be a Muslim, and if born in Europe, to be someone who had converted to Islam. To be a white slave or a white servant in North America in the 1680s was likewise to be understood as a trafficked subject. To be a white slave or a white servant in North America in the 1680s was likewise to be understood as a trafficked subject. A migrant whose whiteness marked his or her fungibility, their capacity to be bought and sold, rather than their rights as a political subject.
You hear that?
A white racial grammar emerged conspicuously in the 1680s in reference to one group, indentured servants. They're the only people described as white. Especially those transported to the New World as felons. The traffic in transported convicts grew sharply in the 1680s, the same decade that witnessed a dramatic expansion in the importation of African slaves to North American plantations in the wake of Bacon's Rebellion. In contrast to Christian servants, the term formerly used to describe all imported indentures, white servants possessed uncertain loyalties, if you read all the correspondence. Here, I'll give you an example. The deputy governor of Barbados characteristically described in 1685 thusly: "We have been obliged to discharge our hired servants, who are a great safety to the island, since they formed most part of the militia, and they also curbed our Negroes and white servants, being the sweepings of jails." The striking distinction drawn here is not between Negroes and white servants, but between unfree laborers who are raced and servants and others who are unraced. Initially, then, the grammar of white skin and whiteness did not articulate privileges, but status as a trafficked and potentially dangerous subject for colonial authorities.
You hear that?
One of the most persistent and terrifying rumors for Barbadian leaders during the late 17th century was an alliance between indentured servants and African slaves. Many of those indentures, I should say, are Irishmen. A threat typically expressed with racial rather than religious signifiers. The language used to describe servant resistance, whether running away, teaming up with African slaves, or speaking instantly to a master, in fact shifted with the emergence of white racial grammar. In the 1670s, before indentured servants were described as white, they were all Christian servants. 8 of 9 descriptions of servant resistance describe them as Christian servants. In the 1680s, by contrast, every description of servant resistance in the colonial state papers mentioned white servants, while none mentioned Christian servants. So what happens is when white grammar emerges, 2 things happen. It's used to describe the most troubled servants, the malefactors, the convicts. It's used to describe their commodification. It's used to describe their rebelliousness, while the language of Christian servanthood shifts. It becomes a language of humanitarian reform, of an effort to kind of ameliorate the conditions of indentured servants. Christian servants had rights. White servants were fungible. So this is not what I expected. Not at all what I expected. The argument being that white racial grammar was not born white supremacist. it became that way. So then the question becomes how and why. What led to that evolution and the creation of an ideology of white victimhood and white power? And the mid-18th century is a moment when the penny press has generating a whole spate of new narratives that are emerging, very often published by anyone who could afford a printing press, and which was not insubstantial, but there were a variety of new narratives entering the popular libraries. And Peter Williamson, his story is remarkable. He was kidnapped as a young boy, sent into slavery, as he described it, as an indentured servant, a very long apprentice contract, 10 years of an indentured servitude in Pennsylvania, at the end of which he was then drafted into the local militia when he fought in the French and Indian War, and was then captured by Delaware Indians and became a captive again, a second captive. And he finally escapes from the Delaware Indian and then returns to Great Britain, where he then publishes his memoir called French and Indian Cruelty. And in it, he embraces some of these new ideas that are emerging about a white identity that really are more than a language of traffic, but also a language of romance and a language and an ideology of victimhood, and some of the things that we've already discussed that are more familiar. At the heart of his story is the white damsel that he comes upon when he himself is a captive. And he finds her tied to a tree, and the Delaware Indians are about to kill her. And he, along with his other fellow captives, find a way to rescue her. And she's actually rescued by a British soldier, a British officer. And then there's that kind of redemption of sorts. And it's an imperial context, certainly. The other way in which I guess I would describe Williamson's whiteness is on display is here, in this image, in which he sold his book in the garb of a Delaware Indian. And so it wasn't enough just to have a really interesting story that linked different kinds of captivity in colonial America. But in fact, he would go to book fairs, these small little marketplaces around his native town of Aberdeen, and would say French and Indian cruelty, and he pretended to be a Delaware Indian. And here he is dressed as one, and he's got his tomahawk, his scalping knife, his shot bag, his bag of wampum, his powder horn, his Indian canoe. Well, that's in the image. He didn't carry that with him. And then a war dance. And so he would perform being Indian. He would perform his capacity to appropriate Indian culture, playing Indian. He was not the first British subject to do this. This kind of love affair with the exotic subject in the empire was not new. What is unique is that he's the first traffic subject himself to do that and to use that as a way of gaining an audience. If you've read the work of David Rodiger, whose work remains foundational to the field of U.S. labor history, it is blackface minstrelsy. It is the institution in which white workers would become white and become white supremacists in the early national period. You have here, in effect, an earlier prototype for that, which is him playing Indian, a trafficked servant doing this work. Indeed, the formation of working classes was closely bound up with a mixture of radical anti-slavery sentiment on the one hand and newly embraced white victimhood. That mixture of whiteness and radical anti-slavery did not preclude the formation of working class consciousness, but rather comprised the cultural and intellectual fabric from which it emerged. White slavery, so-called, was at the formative moment. It was the discourse in which classes emerged in Great Britain and the United States. That trope did not preclude working class support for Black abolitionism, but frequently, in fact, advanced a broader abolition of all slaveries, Black as well as white. So one of the things I also discovered in the research is that white slavery is the political content of whiteness was remarkably divided, and that there was a kind of fight over its political meaning. That is important for recognizing a kind of fault line in contemporary white supremacy. This was not simply an assertion or a naturalized understanding that all white people share something. It had a particular political target in mind, the way it was being used by trafficked subjects. That said, the ways in which whiteness became legitimated as a broader cross-class identity at this moment in time, a political project that was uncertain, fighting abolitionism, as well as supporting it, critiquing imperial policy, as well as supporting other ones, helps understand how we get to the present. And I'm going to shift one more time to the present. And precisely because white victimhood remained at heart a class discourse that critiqued elite assumptions about value and humanity, white slavery also kept the door open as an idea to future working class white supremacists like the Omdurman or David Duke.
Walter Plecker.
David Duke, former Klansman leader, who would write in his book, My Awakening, that white slavery was in fact the historical issue, the footing for his sense of racial injustice.
You hear that?
Because if you know the history of the whole concept of whiteness, if you know the history of the whole concept of the white race, where it came from and for what reason, you know that it was a trick and it's worked brilliantly. See, prior to the mid to late 1600s in the colonies of what would become the United States, there was no such thing as the white race. Those of us of European descent did not refer to ourselves by that term really ever before then. In fact, in the old countries of Europe, we had spent most of our time killing each other. We didn't love each other. We weren't one big happy family. The side of my family that comes from Scotland, hell, they didn't even worry about fighting people outside of Scotland. Highlanders and Lowlanders just fought the hell out of each other. So there was no white race, but in the colonies of what would become the United States, what did we see in the 1660s, 1670s? We began to see that Africans of indentured servant status, many of them not enslaved yet, they were not necessarily permanently enslaved. Some were, others were indentured like many poor Europeans for periods of 7 to 11 years. They could work off their indenture and then they would be free labor technically. Realized, as did the white indentured servants, the Europeans who hadn't even been called white yet, that they had a lot of things in common, like the fact that they were all getting their clock cleaned by the elite. And so they would get together more than our history books taught us, to foment rebellion against the elite, to try to get a better deal for themselves on the basis of economic necessity and economic justice. And what did the elite do? When you see that you're outnumbered by black and white folks who are penniless, landless, peasants, you have to do one of two things. You either have to kill them all, but you can't do that because who's going to work? Rich folks weren't going to. They had to get poor people to work. Whole point was to be a person of leisure back in those days. That was the goal, was not to work. So you couldn't kill them all. You didn't want to kill them all. You had to do the work yourself. You had to build your own levee, build your own house. No. Pick your own tobacco, harvest your own cotton. No, we're not going to do any of that. So you can't kill them, but you can co-opt them. And so the elite in Virginia, for example, in the colony, begins to give certain carrots to people of European descent, saying things like, you know, we're going to let you own a little land, not much, but just a little. And we're going to get rid of indentured servitude. Now you're free labor. And by the way, once you're free labor, you get 50 acres of land just because you're free labor, see? So we're going to cut you in on this deal. We're going to let you enter into contracts. We're going to let you testify in court. And here's the best of all. We're going to put you on the slave patrol to keep those people in line, right? The idea was you're still going to get your clock cleaned. We still don't like you. We still aren't going to really empower you or change your economic subordination, but we're going to make you honorary members of this team, and you're going to help us keep those other people down. And so they got a little taste of power, and it did effectively divide and conquer those coalitions. Those rebellions began to stop almost instantly. Fast forward to the Civil War era, you have rich white folks in the South, where I come from, standing up and openly admitting that the reason they're prepared to secede from the Union, and the only reason they ever articulated publicly, ever, was to maintain and extend slavery and white supremacy, not only where it already existed, but into the newly acquired, that is to say, stolen territories from Mexico to the West. That was what they said. Now we lie about it. We say it wasn't about slavery, that it was about states' rights. Yes, the right of the states to keep and maintain slaves, exactly. But back then they had no shame, so they didn't try and cover it up. They openly said it, but once again, the rich didn't want to go do the work. Are you kidding? No, they're going to get poor people to go fight for them. And the poor folks didn't even own slaves. Now think, how do you get poor people who don't even own the shirt on their back, let alone slaves, to go fight to keep your slaves for you? You've got to convince them that their skin is more important than their economic interest. Because think about it, if I am a farmer who has to charge you $1 a day or $2 a week to work on your farm and harvest that tobacco or pick that cotton, but you can get a black person to do it for free, because you own them, who's going to get the job? Not me. In other words, slavery actually undermined the wages and the wage base, the economic floor of the typical white working class or low income person. But they were told, if these people are freed, they're going to take your job. No, fool, they got your job. That's the point. And so at some level, again, working class white people being harmed by white privilege, relatively being advantaged, right? Being given a leg up, being given a membership to the club, but in absolute terms being kept economically subordinated by the very thing that gave them a sense of superiority. How's that for irony? Then in the present era, this hasn't stopped. This is not ancient history. Now we have people running around insisting that we should close the border with Mexico because if we don't, the wages of working class people will continue to fall. The implication being that the only reason workers are paid like crap in this country is because the border is open. But if you believe that, you would actually have to believe that if that border were closed, that all these owners of capital and industry would just say, oh, well, you figured us out. Here, it's a raise. Do we really believe that the only thing keeping bosses from paying people more is the presence of low-wage, medium, semi-skilled labor from south of this artificial border? Is that really what we believe? We know that if that border is closed, it isn't going to be closed to capital. It isn't going to be closed to goods. If you have a border that can be crossed by capital looking for the highest return on investment or goods looking for the highest price, but labor is chained to its country of origin, how is that going to work to the benefit of working people? By definition, it doesn't. By definition, it immiserates the working class. Divide and conquer. But the best example of all, perhaps, in the contemporary era, in the greater New Orleans area after Katrina. Here you have two communities that were the most hard hit. The lower Ninth Ward, mostly black community, 94% African American, about 40% official poverty rate, heavy working class community. And right across the canal, St. Bernard Parish, Chalmette, 95% white, also working class, high levels of poverty, economically very similar. And at the end of the day, in those first few days of September 2005, more similar than they probably would have realized. Because when those levees broke, they all got their stuff jacked. They all got their stuff destroyed. But if you had asked white folks in Chalmette, and I've done it, who was the cause of the problems in the greater New Orleans area prior to that flooding, they would have pointed across that canal at those black folks, wouldn't have called them black folks, and would have said, there, that's the problem. 70% of the white folks in St. Bernard Parish voted for David Duke, white supremacist, neo-Nazi, former head of the largest Ku Klux Klan group in the United States when he ran for governor in 1991. 7 out of 10 gladly voted for him because he was blaming black folks for all of their problems, and they bought it. What's the irony? The irony is that while they were blaming black people for their problems, while they were blaming black people for the conditions of the greater New Orleans area in which they lived, nobody was paying attention, least of all they, to the fact that these white elite politicians, either in Baton Rouge or in Washington, whose job it was to secure those levees, to make sure that levy funds were spent in the proper way and that they were spent at all, those mostly white and mostly elite politicians did nothing. At the end of the day, it wasn't just the black folks in the lower Ninth Ward they didn't care about. They really couldn't have given a rat's ass about those poor and working class white folks either. And yet, when the people of Chalmette, people of St. Bernard Parish got back into session, first time they had a city council meeting, parish council meeting after the flooding, the lights aren't even on yet. The water isn't even hooked up. And the first order of business was to pass an ordinance saying that you couldn't rent property in St. Bernard Parish to anyone who wasn't a blood relative. Now, I'll leave it to your imagination as to why you'd want to pass a law. That law had never existed before. But now that it's been emptied out and you don't know who might come back, that's a damn good way to keep black people out, isn't it? Because if you're 95% white to begin with, if you pass an ordinance that says that, that's a great, you can't say no blacks need apply. You can't say no blacks allowed, but that was an ingenious way to get around the law. Now, they got caught. There was a lawsuit threatening, they got rid of the ordinance. But my point in bringing it up is to say, once again, divide and conquer is working. These white folks in Chalmette need to march across that canal and join hands with the black folks who've been sitting there more than willing to work with them for an awful long time and march on Baton Rouge and march on DC and march on the Corps of Engineers and recognize their commonality of interest. But the whiteness and the lure of whiteness has tricked these have nothing in their bank account white people into believing that they got more in common with the rich white folks on St. Charles Avenue that didn't lose anything in that flooding than they have in common with the black working class folks who live about 500 yards away.